7i dot comma I dot I dot colon dot y dot I colon dot underscore y 1 dot colon dot comma ij colon underscore dot y dot colon dot l underscore dot iri colon comma y asterisk colon comma colon dot j dot dash I slash l underscore t dot I comma dot ir dot star comma dot colon l colon dot comma underscore colon j colon point 5 colon t colon dot underscore comma I colon dot comma colon dot j comma underscore colon star dot underscore comma colon dash dot I dot star dot colon underscore comma dot colon dot colon r y I dot colon I dot colon underscore underscore colon 3 Viewpoint. A set of ethical principles to guide land use policy. Timothy Beatley. Decisions about land use raise fundamental and complex moral and ethical issues. Yet the existing normative framework traditionally used to guide such decisions is narrowly economic and utilitarian. This article seeks to expand the ethical foundation for land use decisions by proposing a set of tentative principles for ethical land use. These principles are admittedly broad and open to considerable discretion in their specific application. They are presented as ethical starting points, as an initial set of principles for discussion by the land use community. Timothy Beatley is Assistant Professor in the Department of Urban and Environmental Planning, School of Architecture, University of Virginia, Charlottesville, Virginia 22903, USA. These principles are discussed in greater detail in a longer version of this paper, by the same title, available on request from the author. The author is also in the process of preparing a book on the subject of land use ethics for the Lincoln Institute of Land Use Policy. The social allocation of land to different uses and activities is fundamentally and inextricably a problem of ethics. Whether to use a parcel of land for low or moderate income housing or instead for high-priced condominiums is a question of ethics. Whether to preserve mountaintops or riverfronts as natural areas for wildlife habitat and other conservation objectives, or to permit these areas to be used for industrial or recreational activities, is an ethical question. The examples are inexhaustible and they occur in every locality, state, and nation. Thousands of planning commissions, city councils and other citizen boards must make difficult land use decisions almost on a daily or weekly basis. The existing normative framework, however, is insufficient to provide guidance to this massive decision-making arena. In most cases, land use decisions are not usually even considered to be, at least in any explicit way, problems of ethical choice. They are often discussed entirely in technical, legal, or political terms, with little direct acknowledgement that such decisions involve moral choices, decisions about right and wrong, good and bad. The normative framework which has developed is largely economic and is, I believe, inappropriately narrow in scope. What is desperately needed, then, is to expand the land use debate, to begin to recognize that ethical and moral obligations can and do extend beyond narrow economic or utilitarian views. My intent here is to inject some new substance and life into the land use debate. In particular, I will argue that a comprehensive theory of land use ethics must acknowledge a wide range of ethical obligations. Some tentative ethical principles. I present here a series of broad ethical obligations or principles which strike me as requisite at a minimum. They are admittedly quite broad and open to much discretion in their specific application. Indeed, they might more appropriately be characterized as ethical orientations rather than standards or principles. They are offered, however, as a starting point, as an initial set of principles for discussion within the land use community. The reader should note that they are not intended to be organized in any lexical or prioritized manner, but rather each principle is viewed as equally important. Land use decisions must strive to promote the interests of the least advantaged in society. Land use decisions are influential in promoting a just society. Land Use Policy. January 1991. 3. Land use policies are clearly unethical when they serve to worsen the condition of the needy. Public land use decisions have tremendous impact on the welfare and life prospects of individuals. Land use decisions strongly influence the distribution and accessibility of such social resources as housing, jobs, education, health, and medical services. A just society requires that all individuals be assured access to at least minimum levels of these primary social goods. Land use policies are clearly unethical when they serve to worsen the condition of the needy, and when they deprive individuals of basic equality of social and economic opportunity. Ethical land use policy will prevent local or regional policies which result in socially or economically closed and exclusive cities. Point 2. The ethical imperative of ensuring just and open communities can be theoretically grounded in several ways. I am inclined to draw heavily upon Rawlsian theory, in which the principles of a just society are derived through an original position in which individuals decide on these fair principles under conditions of equality and divorced of personal information which might bias the result. I have argued strongly elsewhere for a Rawlsian basis for ethical land use policy. Other important theoretical bases include arguments from natural and human rights, and arguments from equal opportunity, among others. 2. Land use policy must protect the minimum environmental and other rights due to every individual irrespective of income or social position. All members of society have rights to certain minimum levels of primary goods, basic conditions necessary for a flourishing and healthy life. These include unpolluted air and water, personal safety and security, minimum shelter and health care, among others. Such a position would strongly demand land use policies which prevent exposure of citizens to high levels of, say, ozone or carbon monoxide. In addition to protection of basic health and safety, all individuals are entitled to those additional primary goods essential to personal development and fulfillment, including such things as interesting and stimulating visual environments, and access to basic recreational opportunities. Here I find considerable merit in concepts such as the public trust doctrine, which establish that there are certain environmental resources that are of such a public nature and of such public importance that individuals and the broader public cannot be deprived of access to them. 6. Public beaches and coastlines, for instance, are of such recreational, aesthetic, and other importance that they are inherently public in nature. Ethical land use policy will not permit development patterns which prevent use of such resources by all members of society. 3. Ethical land use policy sustains and protects natural ecosystems. Ethics requires small human footprint. The development of land and the growth and progression of cities have typically occurred with little consideration for their impact on natural ecosystems. Wetlands in Florida are drained for new housing projects, deserts are paved over in California for new roads and developments. Beaches, dunes, and barrier islands are destroyed up and down the east coast of the USA to make way for second homes and resort developments. Ethical land use policy acknowledges both the intrinsic and instrumental values of the natural environment. Without the basic functions provided by the ecosystem, human survival would be difficult or impossible. Instrumentally, ethical imperatives require us to recognize the productivity and importance of wetlands, for instance, and the human benefits they provide, e.g. as pollutant filters, as nursing grounds for many forms of aquatic life, etc. Land use ethics must also acknowledge that man is but a plain citizen on the earth and has no right to use land and natural systems in a wasteful manner. Rather, we must admit that nature and natural systems have intrinsic value, irrespective of their utility to man. We must minimize the destructive patterns of land development and urban growth and ensure that the human footprint is a small one. See Timothy Beatley, Development Exactions and Social Justice, in Rachel Alterman, ed., Private Supply of Public Services, New York University Press, New York, 1987. 3. John Rawls, A Theory of Justice, Harvard University Press, Cambridge, Ma. 1971. 4. Timothy Beatley, Applying Moral Principles to Growth Management, Journal of the American Planning Association, Vol. 50, 1984, pp. 458-469. For instance, see Henry Shue, Basic Rights, Princeton University Press, Princeton, New Jersey, 1980, Douglas Ray, Equalities, Harvard University Press, Cambridge, Ma, 1981. E. Joseph Sachs, Defending the Environment, Alfred Knopf, New York, 1971. Aldo Leopold, The Sand County Almanac, Oxford University Press, Oxford, UK, 1949. 4. Land Use Policy. January 1991. ***tj, :** 11. Dash dot. Dot. Comma. Dot backslash dot. Comma. Underscore dot comma. 2. Dot dash comma dot comma dot underscore dot, comma, dash comma comma dot comma. Underscore. I comma underscore dot. Underscore comma. Percent. Comma dot asterisk. Dot underscore. Comma A. Dot. I comma dot. Dot. Comma underscore. Comma. Dot dot r comma dot dash dot dot dash dot dash underscore dot comma c a dot underscore dot I comma dash dot comma y I dot comma underscore comma underscore comma underscore r c dot underscore comma underscore I viewpoint. 4. Ethical land use policy. Life has alleges that man is not the only species on the planet, ethical non-human inherent worth as well. Land use policy takes exception to the commonly held belief that man as a species is intrinsically superior to all others, and that consequently there is no obligation to acknowledge and respect the existence of other life forms. Throughout the world, the growth and expansion of human settlements is resulting in the unprecedented wholesale destruction of natural habitats. Ethical land use policy holds that man is but one of many species on Earth and has no right to act in ways which jeopardize their very existence. In this way, I tend to embrace much of the ethical perspective of biocentrism, as developed by Taylor and others, and which holds that all forms of life, all species on our planet, have inherent worth. A land use ethic which acknowledges this inherent worth of other creatures, and what Ehrenfeld has called the Noah principle, holds tremendous implications for land use policy. Extensive loss of species habitat, to the extent that it is not truly necessary or essential, will not be acceptable. Many development projects may need to be redesigned or scaled down to minimize impacts, or relocated to other sites entirely. Again, the footprint of man must be a small one. Key underpinning of any theory of land use ethics. All harms are not avoidable, however, bringing into play the principle of culpability. Some land use harms may not have been foreseeable. Instance, despite assurances to the contrary, a certain permitted use may create certain harms for the broader public, say, the unexpected contamination of groundwater from a particular industrial process. Culpability requires the causal agent to bear responsibility, financial and otherwise, for this result, in turn assuming appropriate corrective or compensatory actions. In rapidly growing communities faced with dramatic public facility and service needs, it may be entirely consistent with this principle of ethics to require new development to bear a significant portion of the costs of such things as affordable housing, parks and open spaces, and transportation facilities. 6. Ethical land use policy obligations. Uknoto poster yet. Leges important ity and to peoples to come. And generations. 5. Ethical land use policy prevents or the imposition of culpability of harms, the holds those. Minimizes principle them. See Paul Ehrlich and Ann Ehrlich, Extinction, Ballantine, New York, 1981, E0. Wilson, Biodiversify, National Academic Press. Washington, D.C., 1988. For example, see Paul W. Taylor, Respect for Nature, A Theory of Environmental Ethics, Princeton University Press, Princeton, New Jersey, 1986. David Erhenfeld, The Arrogance of Humanism, Oxford University Press, Oxford, UK, 1981. For a more extensive discussion of obligations to future generations see Ernest Partridge, ed., Responsibilities to Future Generations, Prometheus, Buffalo, New York, 1981. Causing land use harms accountable for. Managing land use is often at its heart an attempt to prevent uses and activities which are incompatible with surrounding or adjacent uses, or the interests of the community as a whole. Preventing the siting of a cement factory in a residential zone, however, is not simply a matter of incompatibility, but of fairness. Ethical land use policy prevents this type of activity because it would create certain harms, e.g. noise, airborne pollutants, truck traffic. The principle of harm avoidance is a. Land use policies and actions have tremendous impacts on future peoples, in both short and distant time frames. At the most basic level, land use practices and policies can so foul the planet that life in the future will be difficult and extremely unpleasant. Land is a finite resource and if not conserved and wisely used can be totally exhausted before reaching very distant generations, perhaps making it difficult to feed future generations, for example. Moreover, current generations have tremendous influence over the quality and beauty of future existence. I would strongly argue that man has no right to destroy things of clearly irreplaceable cultural or historic value and significance. The same applies to landscapes, natural or man-made, which may tremendously enrich the lives of future inhabitants. Many places come to mind, including national parks, seashores, wildlife refuges, historic sites, etc. Ethical land use acknowledges the special nature of these areas, and our special role as stewards for the future. Land Use Policy. January 1991. 5. A free society requires a diversity of opinions and interests and a flourishing of personal choice and initiative. 7. Ethical land use policy acknowledges that no political jurisdiction is freestanding. Ethical obligations exist to other jurisdictions, particularly those which are adjacent or surrounding. Land use policy making occurs at a number of different jurisdictional levels, much of it historically at the local level. There is a natural tendency for public officials, and indeed the citizenry in general, to consider only the interests of their own locality or jurisdiction in making decisions. However, actions and decisions taken in one jurisdiction may have substantial impacts on adjoining jurisdictions, or even jurisdictions at considerable distances away. Development in one jurisdiction may contaminate surface water or groundwater used by other jurisdictions, for example. The exclusionary zoning practices of one locality may impose unfair housing demands on other jurisdictions. Clearly, the decisions of one jurisdiction can affect the welfare of others, and land use decision makers have an obligation to view their moral community as extending beyond legal corporate boundaries. There is a basic ethical imperative that each jurisdiction seek to determine, to the extent possible, the impacts of their land use decisions on other jurisdictions, and to factor this information into the decision-making process. Just as individual landowners and users are subject to principles of harm and culpabilitas a priori ity, a jurisdiction obligation to minimize the harm it imposes on other jurisdictions in pursuit of its own land use objectives. Regional equity may also require fair share sacrifices at the local level in a number of areas, including affordable housing, waste disposal, shelter for the homeless, streets, roads, and other transportation facilities, rehabilitation facilities, and others. 8. Ethical land use allows individuals to pursue unique lifestyle choices. Land use policy must assist individuals in pursuing their own fundamental life plans. Land use ethics must address the role and status of individual life plans in the larger planning framework. Recently, serious conflicts have arisen over the location of such uses as churches, parochial schools, and the operation of adult theaters, and over restrictions placed on the number of unrelated individuals allowed to occupy residential units in certain areas. These conflicts raise important questions about the extent to which government, principally at the local level, can restrict personal choice or lifestyle. Where there are no compelling reasons to do so, government land use bodies should refrain from impeding those land uses and activities that are fundamentally tied to one's personal beliefs or life plan. A free society requires a diversity of opinions and interests and a flourishing of personal choice and initiative. Land use ethics must also confront the question of society's right, indeed obligation, to step in when an individual's personal choices lead to placing himself or herself at great risk to life and health. One's life plan, for instance, may involve living on a barrier island, subject to the dangers of hurricanes and other coastal storms. Do our principles of land use ethics permit, or perhaps require, intervention to prevent such individuals from placing themselves at such risk? The principle of protecting lifestyle choices requires special care in enacting such land use restrictions, but it does not preclude completely governmental actions to minimize such risk-taking behavior. 13.9. Public land use authorities must keep the promises they make. Land use ethics requires acknowledgement and respect for explicit and tacit promises made. Many land use disputes are at their center conflicts between the expectations of different parties. Neighborhood homeowners may be indignant, for instance, when their city council grants a rezoning application permitting the construction of a commercial complex in an area they thought was reserved for low-density residential properties. Moreover, the city's comprehensive plan and zoning ordinance may clearly state the city's intention to keep out such undesirable activities. See, for instance, Kenneth Pearlman, Zoning and the First Amendment, Urban Lawyer, Vol. 16, 1984. E. Timothy Beatley, Paternalism and Land Use Planning, Ethical Issues and Practical Applications, in Thomas Addig, Donald Callan, and John Gray, eds. The Restraint of Liberty, Bowling Green State University, Bowling Green, O. 1985. Land Use Policy. January 1991. The neighborhood homeowners feel, probably rightly, that the city has reneged on an explicit promise. Land use promises can also be of a tacit sort, when individual expectations are formed based on historical and consistent patterns of governmental decision-making. 14 Principles of land use ethics acknowledge a public obligation to respect land use expectations which are legitimately formed through explicit or tacit promises. To disregard public promises is to violate a fundamental principle of ethics, and to jeopardize the reciprocity and mutual trust that society heavily depends upon. Ethical land use policy requires that public land use bodies do everything possible to spell out more clearly when public promises are, and are not, issued. Land use policy and decisions must be formulated through a fair and equitable political process. Land use policy making must provide the opportunity for all interested and affected parties to participate. It is important that land use conflicts and decisions be resolved in a context of fair politics, where all interested and affected individuals are able to have their positions and opinions aired. Land use ethics must acknowledge and sustain the basic assumption of political equality, that each individual in the community has a morally equal or equivalent say in what happens. At the most basic level, for example, this requires that potentially affected citizens be duly informed in advance of projects or governmental decisions which may disadvantage them. It will also require, for example, that in considering land use actions public officials must give full and balanced consideration to all legitimate perspectives. Promoting democratic ethics in land use decision-making may, of course, require more radical actions, actions which seek to modify fundamental existing power relationships. Money, educational level, social position, and so on typically translate into greater power in the political arena. Ethical land use policy may require certain programs and policies intended to equalize this political playing field. It might require, for instance, that public funds or personnel be allocated to certain otherwise underrepresented land use constituencies to help them advocate their positions. The ethics of political equality in land use also acknowledges that political decisions must be sensitive to the many constituencies not present and who cannot speak for themselves in land use matters, including future residents, non-human forms of life, children, the mentally handicapped, etc. 11. Land development must be viewed as a privilege, permissible at the discretion of the collective and subject to the conditions of the collective. Land ownership does not imply the right to radically change the environmental integrity of the land. Any set of empirical principles must address the issue of private property in land. A well-established economic and legal institution, private property in land has served many useful societal functions. However, private property, and specifically the development and use of one's land, must be viewed as a privilege, subject to the ethical constraints and standards established by the collective. Land ownership does not imply an inherent right to use land in whatever way one wishes, especially when the proposed uses would create substantial public harms or would significantly alter the natural ecosystem functions performed by the land. While basic fairness requires society to compensate a landowner when it physically expropriates land, land use ethics does not demand compensation for the mere loss of speculative or development value due to legitimate public land use regulation. Further development. These broad ethical principles constitute a very preliminary listing of the possible components of a theory of land use ethics. There is considerable additional work to be done in developing and refining such a theory. First, some approach must be developed by which conflicts between these broad 1.4 a more detailed discussion of promises and expectations. See Timothy Beatley, The Role of Expectations and Promises in Land Use Decision-Making, Policy Sciences, Vol. 22, No. 1, March 1989, pp. 27-50. See, for instance, Paul Davidoff, Advocacy and Pluralism in Planning. Journal of the American Institute of Planners, Vol. 31, 1965, pp. 331-338. Land Use Policy. January 1991. 7. Y.I.T. C1. I.J, I.I. Y, C, dot y, I, dot, dot. Viewpoint L I, dot underscore, dot L, I, dot, dot Y, T dot underscore, dot, y dot y dot, v point 1 dot, 1, dot I dot, principles can be resolved. This might take the form of either a prioritizing or lexical ordering of the above principes, or the development of an additional set of principles specifically intended to break such moral ties. A second and related need is the preparation of a more specific set of rules of conduct which would flow directly from the broad ethical principles, and which might provide more concrete guidance to planners and policy makers faced with specific I&U's dilemmas. The rules of conduct might be organized by individual ethical principle or could be a freestanding list. Any single rule of conduct might satisfy several, perhaps all, of the ethical principles above. For example, a rule of conduct which prohibits development of floodplains and riverine ecosystems, other things being equal, responds to principles of protecting other forms of life, to principles of sustaining and protecting the natural ecosystem, to providing a minimum level of safety to all individuates. And so on. 8. Land Use Policy January 1991.